It's kind of hard to follow you, so I'm going to do my best. When Joe and I were talking about what I could help contribute to this group, I really felt like what was in my wheelhouse was assessment, because that's where I do a lot of my research, and also just where my passion is. So again, like the morning session, I don't have all the answers. I have a lot of ideas, and I invite you to use the chat to embroider onto my ideas or share your own, and to put questions there. And I'm hoping Quinn will pay attention to the questions for me. Okay, so you've heard me talk about this, you've heard Phil talk about this. This is something we're familiar with as educators, and that is really thinking about what it is we want our students to know and using that as a framework for designing our assessment and instruction. We refer to it as backwards design, scientific teaching, or just darn good practice. And there's tools at the ASBMB website that can help you clarify for yourself what those learning outcomes are. But today I want to talk to you about assessments and then how we can adapt them in the remote environment with some of the anticipated problems that we have. And so I just want to be clear what I mean by assessment here. I really mean it's our way of determining the degree to which students are achieving a desired learning outcome. So it's not just, if we think about the desired learning outcome being reaching the top of a peak, it's not just that piece, right? It's also being able to understand where students are along the pathway so that I can support their learning and so that they can self-diagnose where they are on the journey and make adjustments if they get lost or take a wrong turn. I always like to bring this analogy because I want to point out that there's no one-size-fits-all assessment. And so when we think about assessing student learning, we need to identify diverse ways to collect evidence of what students know and try to, just like we do in science, gather multiple lines of evidence to make a distinction about what a student has or has not achieved in the classroom. I also like to point out that it's pretty easy to kind of think that our students are starting down here at the bottom of the mountain, but our students can join us anywhere on the journey. And actually our students can take pathways that are completely unanticipated to us. So we need to think about ways of assessing student learning that can help both us and the learner make that trek as efficiently as possible. From a student standpoint, when I first started teaching and I would say, I have all these learning outcomes for you, and that we're gonna go through them in this class and you're gonna learn them, I did a very poor thing. I didn't communicate to my students specifically what those learning objectives were. And so my students really thought that my syllabus was the set of learning objectives, right? So when they came back to study and they're getting ready for exam 1, they would go, okay, I've got to go to the lecture notes that are called amino acids, and I've got to kind of like slurp all that into my brain. And that's not to say that I wasn't teaching using active learning. I very much was, but the way that I was communicating what I wanted students to know and be able to do was very antiquated. It was very lecture oriented and transmissionist in nature. And so what I've started doing is really being very clear about what it is I want students to know and be able to do for each exam, each unit, each lesson, which sometimes generates kind of an unwieldy list of learning objectives. But my students have reported repeatedly that this is useful for them because it really helps them focus their learning. So for here, I have just a sample of 3 out of a long list of learning objectives that I'm sure are quite similar to anybody in this Zoom room who has taught intro biochem. These are pretty ubiquitous. But the reason that I like these sorts of learning objectives is that they're quite measurable. I can actually determine and measure a student's ability to recall, classify, or compare, which is much different than saying I want students to understand. Because students don't really have a good idea of how they're going to be asked to demonstrate their understanding. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm basing this presentation. There's so much to talk about with assessment in only 30 minutes, and so I'm kind of basing it on some questions I've gotten from faculty in my department as we were transitioning, and there was some angst in that transition for all of us. Some of it revolved around oh my goodness, now I'm going to be assessing online, and no one's we didn't have the resources in the department to have like a proctoring service. So how am I going to keep students from cheating? How am I going to make sure that my exam resources, the integrity of them, is maintained? So there's a lot of anxiety around that. And so I kind of crafted these examples to help people think about not only like to kind of shift what they were doing in the classroom to online. And then I have some kind of off the wall ideas for the end that might get me booed off the stage, and that's okay. I just want to leave you like really thinking that there is no one size fits all. So gosh, what are we going to do to really measure student learning? Okay. All right, so I'm going to start with an example of remote teaching with a large class size. And though I have the luxury at Washington State of teaching a smaller class, my largest class is only 75. It's like lovely. My jam has always been the large lecture. I love large lecture. I know I'm crazy, but that's where I really think about things. And so I've been supporting faculty in their transition into large lecture. And one of the things they were worried about was, you know, how am I going to assess what's going on online in a way that is really like reflecting my students' knowledge and not Cheg's knowledge or not their neighbor's knowledge. So let me just give you a picture. So if this was one of the learning outcomes that we had, it's kind of traditional, and a kind of traditional way to assess that might be just to ask them, right? You can imagine a pen and paper in-person quiz, and this is like one of the introductory questions that you have. Just going to make sure they can do what I want them to do. Great. Now, if we were to do this in the online environment, we would anticipate that a student could very quickly Google that. And so therefore, we haven't really assessed their ability to recall. We've assessed their ability to Google. Similarly, we might have for our other learning outcome about classifying amino acids according to their chemical and structural properties. We could ask students to identify, right? And this one might be might take them a little bit more time to Google, but they could do it and they could demonstrate that they know that. But again, we wouldn't be able to discern if it was them or their buddy telling them or something else, if you don't have a proctoring service, okay? But then I would say, okay, if my real goal is to get at the utility of understanding amino acids, then I should really ask them something that's a little bit more applied. And so here I can craft a question that requires them to be able to recall 1 or 3-letter abbreviations. I could have made these distractors as 1-letter abbreviations easily. And they should know something about the chemical and structural properties of all of these. Otherwise, they won't be able to answer this question, which aligns with my third learning outcome. And so I paused so that you could read, because I know it's really hard to read and hear someone talk at the same time. But the beauty of this question, you're thinking like, yeah, I've written this sort of question before, Erica. This is a no-brainer. But the reason I love this sort of question is that even if a student were to cut and paste this and put it into Chegg, I can come up with like an infinite number of options for A, B, C, D. And so they still have to know how to do the question, even if it's in Chegg. So they still have to know what the abbreviations stand for, and they still have to know how to classify. And they're gonna run out of time if they're trying to look all of that up in order to answer this one question, because the rest of them are gonna be like this, right? And so you could imagine this question that you already have in your question bank somewhere. I'm sure you have questions like this. Now you're thinking about those which you can generate multiple options very quickly so that it becomes hard for them to be checkable. And then you can, if you have a large class size, you might be constrained to doing only multiple choice. That's okay. I mean, this is not it's an easy question, but it's also not, it's not a question that I would hang my head in shame. I think it's a reasonable question to ask students. So if you're thinking about a class size of 300 and you need to create an opportunity where students are being assessed, you've tightly aligned this to learning outcomes. I just showed you that on the previous slide. These are the outcomes that I'm measuring. They're consistent with what I had on my syllabus. And I can design one question that's actually assessing all 3 learning objectives. And if I change the distractors on all of them, I can essentially have 5 to 10 different ones that my course learning management system can draw from. So student 1 gets flavor A of question 1, this person gets flavor B, flavor C, etc. And so now you've basically generated quasi-randomized exams for all your students so that almost everybody's getting a different exam, yet you're still truly assessing the same understanding. Okay, so that's one way to think about it. And I understand that that can seem like a lot of work, but if you go through your old questions with the eye of, does this question assess multiple objectives? And can I generate very quickly a quasi-infinite number of options? Then it really doesn't take that much time to get something like this uploaded into your learning management system. Another question I had from folks was, well, my students want to know how they did on the exam. And so that requires me giving them the exam. And once I give them the exam, they're going to upload it. And then now my exam has been compromised. And so I don't want to do that because look at all the work I just did to make this beautiful thing. And I would say, well, I have a lot of different thoughts about that, but here's one thought. One thought is you can give students feedback about their performance on exam items without actually revealing the keyed response. And that is possible if you've really clearly defined your learning objectives for students. So again, I can have the exam, this would be if you're giving the exam sort of synchronously in the online environment. And then when students are finished, they're going to get automatic feedback that comes back to them. And it's not overly vague, but it's not overly specific either. So you're not necessarily losing the integrity of your exam or risking that there's a screen capture maybe going on. It still can happen, but you're just reducing the likelihood. And so here's some feedback that I might give to students. I might say, this item I designed to target these learning objectives. And you didn't get it right. So if you wanted to get better at that learning objective, I want you to go back to these lectures, this part of the textbook, and also there's these practice questions online that you had before the exam, and I think you should revisit them and redo them. So it gives them something actionable to do and to review without like revealing your entire exam. Okay, so that's one way you can approach it, and there are others that I'm sure are going to pop up in the chat as well. Why is it not doing that? I lost something on there. The real question I have though for you is, do we have to assess every single learning objective on every single quiz or exam? And what I mean by that is there are some of these learning objectives that we want our students to demonstrate mastery of, but I don't need to put on my exam, because if they don't have mastery of it, they won't be able to perform well on these other exam questions. But I also don't want to assume they got it, because then my students are going to come in and fail the exam. So what can I do? I would say that we think about other ways of measuring students' progress and identify those learning objectives for which it might make more sense that we take a competency-based approach, and that we put the onus on the student to achieve that competency. And that means we have to clearly define what that competency means. So for example, I could imagine generating a series, a question bank, much like our traditional ones about identifying amino acids, so that it's generating a quasi or basically a random one for every student. They can take it on their own time. And I say to them, you can take this is a screen capture of what is in Blackboard, but I can say to students, look, this quiz is available to you. You can take it as many times as you want. I'm going to keep the highest grade. And I've also said things like, you only get 10 minutes to do it. So that means that they have to, you're requiring them to actually recall it and not rely on other materials. But then I say, as long as you get 90% or better, I'll give you full credit on it, right? Like, to me, being able to accurately recall all of the amino acids on this assessment in 10 minutes. You should be able to do it. You have to hit 90%. I'm going to call that competent. And you'll get credit for it. And there's going to be a column in my grade book for that. Do it whenever you want. Also know that if you haven't met competency, the exam is going to be really hard. So I'm actually doing you a favor by doing this. Okay. So again, it might be perceived as spoon feeding. I don't think so. I think it's a way of really getting students to think about communicating to them what competency means, giving them a mechanism to practice and demonstrate it, but the onus is on them. So that's an example for a large classroom. And I did this at North Dakota State University, and it worked really well because it meant my students were coming into class prepared. Actually, I had some other constraints around it for the in-person environment, but I imagine it would work just as well for remote. Okay, an example for small class size. So small classes are fun, right? Because you can write whatever kind of assessment you want. And in theory, you have the time to grade it, which you wouldn't be possible in a large lecture class. You're really limited by how many exams you have to grade. And right now I'm thinking about summative assessment. I decided not to talk a lot about formative assessment, but that is my jam too. So if you ever want to talk about that, let's do that. But in a small class size, I'm just gonna give you a different scenario here. What I'm thinking about here is a smaller class size, maybe up to 40, maybe up to 50. And here are some sample learning objectives. So these are from my class this spring. They'd already learned some basic metabolism in the first semester, but now we're kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of other metabolic pathways, and we're really focusing on integration and regulation and that sort of thing. And here we're talking about fatty acid synthesis, oxidation, lipid metabolism, and that's the whole unit. And so we would have spent some time teaching them about those, but by and large, because they're seniors and they would have had it at an introduction to those pathways earlier on, I'm just assuming that they know the basic facts. And that they should be able to demonstrate that they know how to use them in this class. Where my real emphasis in this class is here is I want them to be able to make predictions. I want them to be able to demonstrate to me that they understand how to apply a systems thinking approach to metabolic problems. And importantly, I want them to be able to generate and evaluate scientific hypotheses. So they get that in the lab, yes, but there's no reason I can't be reinforcing that in the lecture. And in fact, I should be routinely. Okay, so this is kind of a big deal because if I want them to be able to evaluate and generate hypotheses, they have to have some scientific understanding, basic content with which to reason about those hypotheses. So they do have to know the basics of metabolism and the basics of the pathways that I'm asking them about. And they do have to know about regulation and how hormones come into play and all of that. So I am responsible for helping them gain that basic competency. When I'm assessing them though, in an online environment in a small class, I didn't have Proctorio, but I did run my exam just like this in Zoom. They all logged on. They did not have to have their video on. I didn't care. I just wanted to be there with them in case they had questions. I trusted them and they trusted me. And plus these questions are hard. And so that means that in that sort of environment, these students are going to have access to their lecture notes. They're going to have access to whatever it is that they need. Here's just a example of something that they had in their lecture notes. And so I knew they had it. But then I devised questions that were testing their understanding of being able to predict changes. And I used something called jumble sentence in Blackboard. It's basically when you click on any of these boxes, it has 4 or 5 words that they can select from. And they're always really not very helpful. It's like increased, decreased, no change. And they've got to figure it out, okay? And the reason I ask this question is it's really helping me understand if they understand how different, how many times can I say understand? A lot. I can say understand a lot in one sentence. But it helps me see if they know the basics of the metabolic pathways I'm going to be asking them about in just a second. Then I'm going to move on. Once I've kind of assessed their understanding of what they know about the metabolic pathways and some of those basic learning outcomes. Now I'm going to go into the harder stuff about scientific hypotheses. And what that means, and I made this small so you wouldn't feel compelled to read the whole thing. What this means is I'm giving them something that is a very rich, authentic context. So I've gone through and read a boatload of papers, much like Joe, because love geeking out on reading papers. And what I've done is I have found a conundrum in the literature, a historical conundrum, and that there are two competing hypotheses in the literature. And so I give the students the background information that they need. And then I say, okay, here are two hypotheses, and you are going to be evaluating some data to then evaluate them. Okay, so in this one, I'm only assessing the evaluate, and another part of the exam, I assess generate. Now, what I want you to think, and then with the end goal is eventually in Blackboard, they're going to be clicking in which of these hypotheses has the most support. Okay, we're not proving a hypothesis correct, we're ruling hypotheses out. And which one of these, how do your data actually help you rule them out? That's the end goal. But, if I were to just jump right to that last question, which is, which of these hypotheses can you rule out with figures 1, 2, or 3? I wouldn't know if they got it right because they guessed, got it right for the wrong reason, got it wrong, but really had a lot of correct reasoning, or if they texted with their buddy and just put what they put, right? And so what I needed to do was, before I got to that final question, I had to ask a lot of other questions to make sure that I could really assess the whole student's understanding about the content and their ability to evaluate a hypothesis. So what that means is that I had separate questions for each of the data figures, and this is very small, I apologize. And with each one of these, there were several multiple choice questions that helped me understand what they could interpret from the data. So I could understand if, they didn't actually get the hypothesis question right because they couldn't understand the data. Okay, now I know that the problem was with the data. Or, if previously they were having problems with the content, I could kind of tease that apart. And then once I understand if they can understand, I gotta stop saying understand. Once I see if they know how to interpret data properly, then I ask them, all right, which of these hypotheses can you rule out? And then finally, the important question, the one where I get to see what they really can do, is completely open-ended. So all of the ones before that were in Blackboard. They were either multiple choice or fill in the blank. They were all auto-gradable. This is the one for this section on hypothesis testing. It's the only one that I have to grade. And I have a rubric already set up. So it's very clear. It's the same rubric I've been using with students about how they should frame their response. And so for this one, they have to actually talk about each of those data figures, why it supports or why it does not. And in this way, if students didn't have all of the pieces, I'm still able to evaluate and give partial credit and really understand the extent to whether or not they're achieving the learning goals I had set out for them. It's a lot of talking in a very specific example, but what I want to point out to you is that for these, because they're coming directly from the primary literature, and because we're asking students to do such generative and higher order thinking, they don't have time or energy to be doing anything other than thinking about it. And because I've established that trust and that climate ahead of time, my students dug in and loved this exam. I had 3 students who weren't required to take the exam who took the exam because they think it's fun. So that's what happens when you do this sort of stuff with your students. And then I think I have maybe 2 minutes to do a really quick boo off the stage kind of suggestion, and that is I want you to think about just abandoning this idea of I assess my students' understanding using quizzes and exams or a one-shot time edit, but really think back to that competency-based grading. And this is something, again, I did in a large lecture class. I implemented contract grading. And contract grading sounds like a lot, but it's actually, I think, really doable and in some ways preferable. So contract grading is where the students contract with the instructor a number of assignments at a particular level of quality that will earn them the grade that they want. Okay, what this means from the standpoint of the instructor is that you have to define what is a passing grade, right? Like, what is the bare minimum that a student needs to demonstrate in order for me to feel good saying that they got a C? And then identifying, you know, which assignments you're going to have in class and where the bar is for each of those assignments is one way to do it. Or it could be a certain number of assignments that they do. But then you articulate the benchmarks for, you know, a passing grade, a B level grade, an A level grade. If you go on them, pluses and minuses, you do it there. And so then a student writes to you and says, hey, Dr. Offerdahl, I'm contracting for an A. And so I can check in with them. And what's great about this is some of my students go, I'm contracting for a C. And now I know like what I'm expecting from them. And I'm no longer tearing my hair out trying to figure out why I'm not connecting with them in the way that I wanted to. But a lot of them contract high. Some of them, I tell them that if throughout the semester they want to renegotiate their contract, they can. So some negotiated a B, and then they see that they're doing really well and they renegotiate for an A. But the key for this is that for each of those assignments, I set a clear designation as to when the assignment is done, like when you've demonstrated mastery, okay? And that varies from assignment to assignment. But then students turn it in. They can get an opportunity to revise. I always give them one opportunity to revise. So if they submit it to me and I say, ooh, you didn't quite make it, here's the rubric that goes along with it. You get one more chance to revise. Then they can, and I can look at it again and say, okay, you've met competency here. If you have a really large class, I would say only let one opportunity for revision, but if you have a smaller class, you can do more. You could also take a portfolio approach. This is not dissimilar to taking a portfolio approach. The great part about this is it can reduce academic integrity issues because there's a little bit more clarity about what students are supposed to do. And they also, with that opportunity to revise and work slightly at their own pace, helps them, and it gives them the space that allows them to engage with the material in a positive way rather than a way that puts them at jeopardy of violating academic integrity. For me, in some cases, it amounted the time I've spent on grading. So for a large lecture, no, but when I've done this with 40 to 50 students, it really reduced the amount of time I spent on grading because I had well-defined rubrics. I was just looking for competency. I didn't have to grade things looking for partial credit. I just wanted to know if they knew it. And really, again, this is a way to increase student self-efficacy and self-regulated learning. And I do have some data related to self-regulated learning that I think is beyond the scope of this particular talk. But if you want to know about my experimental data, I can share that with you. This is a lot in one slide, but what I want to tell you is that you might be thinking, well, great, if a student contracts for a C or contracts for a B, like they're really, like somehow we've watered it down for them. Somehow we're not maintaining the rigor. Like somehow we're making this easier for them. And so we did this experiment in introductory biology and introductory biochemistry. This is just the biochemistry data. And what we saw was that if we looked at just the actual raw scores that the students would have earned had this been a traditional course, right, where I assign points to every little thing and then add them up at the end, and 400 is a cutoff for the A and 300 is a cutoff for the B. What we found was that there was statistically significant shift. So if a student contracted and completed the contract, they outperformed students who didn't opt for the contract. And even if a student started out on a contract, but then voided their contract by not, there's a way to void the contract, they still did better. And that was true even if I controlled for like their performance on the first exam, because they contract after the first exam to kind of get a feel of how well they're doing. And it was also true if I control for their scores on a pre-test and GPA. So kind of cool stuff, a little bit out there, maybe beyond the scope of what you're thinking here, but there might be ways for you to think about implementing a competency-based assessment into pieces of your course so that you can really focus all your time on those higher order skills that I know that we all care about and really think are important for our students. So this is where we're at. I finished just in time, and I'll leave it open for questions or comments.
Thank you. That was excellent. There were a couple of questions that came up. One, if for your quizzes where they can retake the test, do they retake the quiz? Do they retake the entire quiz, or do they just have to do the part of the quiz that they missed?
Oh, like for the early on with the competency, I make them redo the whole thing.
Okay.
Because, and this aligns with what we know from cognition, is that part of it is just giving them an intentional, it's called, oh my goodness, basic thing. It's recall practice, right? But it's very intentional recall practice. So when we give students plenty of context and practice recalling information, retrieval practice. So retrieving from long-term memory in a short-term memory, and when you put it into working memory and have them manipulate it, the likelihood that it gets integrated more tightly into your schema is increased. So if I only have them do the questions that they got wrong, that's against what we know from human cognition. So we really do need to have them do more of that intentional retrieval so that they can interact with multiple cognitive elements and working memory at one time.
Thank you. Second question, when you talk about this kind of scaffold question where they have to answer some early questions to get to that larger hypothesis at the end, if they get the first parts wrong, that suggests that they'll get the entire question wrong, correct?
You would think, but like this is actual literature and data. And so the data that I have for them actually supports both hypotheses, and they have to actually think about those data together. So there are ways where that's not to say they can get everything right, but they can get early things wrong, but then put those pieces together in a way that makes sense, and they get credit for that.
Thank you. And then
it took 3 semesters to get it right.
The last question is a 3-part question, at least my last question. For the contracts, this has been addressed somewhat in the chat room, but have you done it with freshmen? 2, do you have rubrics? Mm-hmm. And 3, I've already forgot the third part, but if you can answer those 2 parts, please.
The royal we, my collaborator did it at the introductory level with introductory students. I did it with juniors in a large lecture, and I've done it with seniors and graduate students. The rubrics I have some rubrics. I would say, like, as Joe said, this was early on, and so I wouldn't say they're perfect rubrics, but I'm always happy to share with the giant asterisks that they probably could use some refreshing.
Yep. And how many times have you seen a contract student contract for an A that gets an A-?
Well, okay, so the language in the I would say never, I haven't seen it, but I'm trying to think about like for the AA- thing. But I have seen instances where a student hits like all of the criteria except for one. And so what I say for each level is like, you have to hit all the criteria for the grade before that, plus these additional 2 or plus this additional 1. And so if they don't hit all of them, then they're down to the A-. But what's great about it is that it's kind of like a bingo board, and they keep track of what they've hit mastery at. And when they see they only have 1 left, they'll do anything to hit mastery at that before the end of the class. What I see happen most often is students go, I don't want to do the contract. I just want to get straight points. And they've done that. So contract grading is something I've done as an option, not as a mandatory.
And for clarification, say they contract for an A, but they get a B. I mean, how many students are upset about that? How does that go?
They haven't been. So the folks that have done an A to a B, usually they're getting communication from me ahead of time that says, you probably already know this, but you're missing 3 of the criteria. Are you going to be able to make an A this semester? And they look at everything else they have to do, and they go, no, I guess, yeah, I'm going to be okay with a B. It's just something about like, there's the bar. You've known about it all semester. I haven't had any students complain about it.
Thank you. And thank you for 2 excellent talks. I really appreciate it.